Today is the 200th anniversary of Jane Austen's death in Winchester in 1817. The Sydney Institute has kindly invited me to speak on the topic, Jane and D'Arcy, fact or fiction. In Jane and D'Arcy, I write about events that occurred in Jane Austen's youth. It is a story of Jane Austen and D'Arcy Wentworth, their youthful romance and adventures, the heartbreak of their separation, and the impact on the rest of their lives. David Marr has said that the most important aspect of writing a biography is to ensure that you catch the real person. Jane and D'Arcy is a biography of two people. I believe I have dismantled many of the fictions woven around each of them over time, revealed long hidden facts, and captured two real people. I have told the story from a Wentworth family perspective. My uncle Bill Wentworth asked me in 2002 to write it. I'd never read Jane Austen. I had only a broad general knowledge of the period. I came at the story looking for the facts, but perhaps the most difficult task was sorting them out from the fictions about Jane Austen that have persisted unquestioned for 200 years. Jane Austen enthusiasts know her only from her later life, from her selected letters and her novels published in her late 30s and early 40s. Her youth is unknown to them. It was hidden away from public view. Her family suppressed any information about her teenage years, and that suppression has been maintained for over 2 centuries. In Jane's own writing from this time, she presented herself as a vital, exuberant, and adventurous. Jane Austen was born on the 16th of December 1775 at Steventon in Hampshire, where her father, the Reverend George Austen, was the rector and ran a boarding school for teenage boys, preparing them for university entry. She was the 7th of 8 children. She had 5 older brothers, an elder sister, and who was almost 3, a younger brother born 3.5 years later. In her youth, Jane Austen felt a great insecurity. While still a babe in arms, she was sent from home to live with a neighbouring dairy farmer and his wife. The wife breastfed her, and Jane lived with them until she was old enough to run about and talk. She was almost 4 when her second eldest brother, George, was sent away to the care of a distant neighbour, unwanted because of his disability. When she was 7, her third eldest brother, Edward, was sent away to Kent to live with wealthy childless relatives, to become their son and heir. At 7, Jane was sent to boarding school near Oxford with her older sister Cassandra and a cousin, Jane Cooper. The school relocated to Southampton, where Jane nearly died of typhus fever. At 10, she and Cassandra were sent to another boarding school in Reading, making room for their father to enrol more boarders in his school in the Steventon Rectory. It occurred to Jane she may have been found in a haystack by the Austens and adopted by them. Her insecurity may have predisposed her to a restless, rebellious and romantic youth. She was encouraged by her sister Cassandra and cousin Eliza de Feuilly. She wrote stories about her youth and plays, and they were recorded a great deal about her romance and adventures with D'Arcy Wentworth. D'Arcy was a tall, handsome Irish surgeon who'd come to London to gain accreditation from the company of surgeons that would give him employment in the East India Company. During this time, while waiting an appointment, he attended lectures and walked the wards at St Bartholomew's Hospital to gain further practical experience. In the evening, to support himself, he played cards for money. As a cousin, friend and protege of Lord Fitzwilliam, he had entree into London society and to the up-and-coming young society gamblers. He was often disillusioned by their failures to pay their losses. He even held up some of them to recover these debts. It was a dangerous method of debt collection. It put him in a category of highwaymen. Several disgruntled gambling colleagues took him to court, principally to name and shame him. As prosecutors, they did not want to be outed themselves as defaulters on gambling debts, and would abandon their cases by failing to appear, to recall events, or to recognise him. D'Arcy was arrested and sent to Newgate, awaiting trial in the Old Bailey. He found himself a celebrity in the court and a popular villain in the press. At first, the Austens were thrilled with Jane's attachment to somebody who was so well connected. When they learnt of D'Arcy's notoriety, they became very anxious about their teenage daughter's involvement with him and dissuaded her from travelling to Botany Bay as his wife. It is understandable that the Austens closed ranks to protect Jane from criticism and to salvage the good name of the family. It is understandable they were hostile to her marriage to a notorious highwayman, that they prevailed on Jane to abandon him, that their relationship and his name were never to be mentioned again. 2 weeks after they parted, D'Arcy left England for New South Wales. His departure was timely for the Austen family. Their secrecy was reinforced by his disappearance and his silence. The day before D'Arcy sailed, Jane's brother Henry wrote in the Loiterer, reflecting his family's sentiment, when he applauded the world for getting rid of all surplus inhabitants, all those who have too much cunning and too little money, shipped off with the very first cargo of convicts to Botany Bay. From this time until the end of her life, Jane remained confined within the family circle. She resented the persuasion of her family. Under pressure, she had rejected D'Arcy, but she never stopped loving him. She hoped and she wished and waited like the heroic Penelope for his return. For both, it was a heartbreaking decision. D'Arcy remained the fixed star in her firmament and the love of her life. Like a Homeric Greek tragedy, it was sad and lamentable. D'Arcy sailed on the Second Fleet aboard the Neptune, the worst of the 3 slave ships used in that convoy. He was the first paying passenger to arrive in the colony, and though not appointed from London, he found work immediately as a surgeon. He served in Sydney, on Norfolk Island, at Parramatta. His patients were mainly convicts, paupers and emancipists, those convicts who had served their time or received pardons. He served under 7 governors and worked closely with most of them, but it was with Macquarie he found immediate rapport. Governor Macquarie came ashore in Sydney on New Year's Day 1810. After the debacle of the Rum Rebellion, he knew he would need able and reliable men to support him. He recognised D'Arcy as enlightened and intelligent, someone he could trust. He knew instinctively he had found the right person to help him to realise his vision for a better society for the colony. Both men were over 6 feet tall. They were the same age, 47, born a fortnight apart. From the outset, Macquarie placed new and heavy responsibilities on D'Arcy's shoulders. Within 8 months, Macquarie had appointed him Principal Surgeon of the Colony, Treasurer of the Colonial Fund, Chief Magistrate and Superintendent of Police, Justice of the Peace, a member of the Court of Civil Jurisdiction, and a Commissioner of the first major building project, a turnpike road to be made forthwith between the town of Sydney and the Hawkesbury. Later in that year, D'Arcy was invited to join the members of the winning tender to build the Rum Hospital in Sydney, to contribute his knowledge and experience in the design and construction. D'Arcy was Macquarie's great assistant, and he rose to each new challenge. In the years that followed, he took on other demanding and ambitious projects. He was a founding director of the colony's first bank, the Bank of New South Wales, and later its president. When Macquarie established a native institution for the education of Indigenous children at Parramatta, he appointed D'Arcy to the Committee of Management. An army of historians, biographers and critics have laboured for nearly 200 years over the story of Jane Austen and the sources and significance of her writing. They were aware that the family had destroyed most of her letters and suppressed her early writings, and that for more than 50 years, though often asked, the family members had refused to provide any information about her. In 1869, 52 years after Jane Austen's death, her nephew, James Edward Austen Lee, finally gave way to the growing public interest in her and published his memoir of Jane Austen. He said very little about her youth, though he admitted that the family had refused to release her early stories. He described them as ridiculing the improbable events and the exaggerated sentiments which he had met with in sundry silly romances. He summed up Jane's life as singularly barren, few changes, and no great crisis ever broke the smooth current of its course, and there was no definite tale of love to relate. Most, if not all, her readers simply didn't believe him. But despite their unreliability, for 150 years, the Jane Austen critics and biographers have reiterated these fictions. They have left hidden the secrets her family did not want revealed. A few raised questions about the fictions around her life, but never seriously explored them. They turned a blind eye to clear and obvious references in Jane Austen's writings that contradicted her family claims and might have directed their research to reveal something of her secrets. We know there was difficulties put in their way. Virginia Woolf declared nearly 100 years ago, Anybody who has the temerity to write about Jane Austen is aware that there are 25 elderly gentlemen living in the neighbourhood of London who resent any slight upon her genius as if it were an insult to the chastity of their aunts. I can add that there is a much larger contingent to take on today than the 25 elderly gentlemen. Today there are hundreds of university departments, students, professional Janeites and groups of enthusiasts who talk and read and write about Jane Austen. It is a cohort that prefers to regurgitate fictions, not to look for facts. To quote Professor Peter Washington, who edited the Everyman's volume on Jane Austen's juvenilia, they suffer from a literary form of heritage syndrome, or HS. What really turns them on is historical recreation, and they rejoice in their rigor mortis. I've endeavoured to reveal the Jane portrayed by her own writings, not the fictional myths promoted by her family and maintained for the last 200 years. In my search for facts, not fiction, I followed lines of inquiry that seemed to me to be fairly obvious. If there was nothing to hide, why, soon after she died, did the family destroy most of Jane's correspondence? Why did her sister Cassandra take up her scissors and cut certain references from the letters from Jane that she kept? The first of Jane Austen's remaining letters date from January 1796. Covers the arrival of Tom Lefroy at Ashe. Was this a deliberate ploy by the next generation of her family? Even though Jane says in this letter, "I do not care sixpence for Tom Lefroy," Jane Austen aficionados claim he was her real love. He came into her life 6 years after D'Arcy's departure and well after the completion of her most significant juvenilia stories. None of Jane's letters remain from 1801 to late 1804. There are only 3 between August 1805 and mid-1808, and no letters left from June 1811 to November 1812, or from November 1813 to March 1814. These were all periods in her relationship with D'Arcy, important periods. Her biographer, David Noakes, commented that in this period, tracing the life of Jane Austen is like searching for a missing person. Did the Austen family suppress her early stories, the 3 volumes of the juvenilia, because many of them related directly to the period and the events of her romance with D'Arcy? From these early writings, it's quite clear that Jane's chronological age did not reflect her maturity, knowledge, or intellectual development. One can understand why it would have been difficult to impede her great desire to discover the wide and exciting world that lay beyond the rectory at Stephenson and what it might offer. From the age of 13, Jane read her stories aloud after dinner for her family amusement. Many of them dealt with the young girl finding her way to adulthood, with love, sex and marriage, with schemes to defeat the wishes of despotic parents, of youths hurrying off to Scotland. At age 15, Jane wrote of visiting Newgate and appearing in court. At 16, she declared she had married without the consent or knowledge of her father. Her juvenilia was not released for publication until more than 100 years after her death. The second volume, was released first in 1922. The first volume was published in 1933, and the third volume was not released until 1951, 134 years after Jane's death. In one of these stories, Leslie Castle, she recorded a visit to Scotland and described her impressions in detail. Years later, in a letter to Cassandra, Jane recalled that a coach trip had put me in mind of my own coach between Edinburgh and Stirling. In 1913, two of her great nephews added a footnote to the letter protesting a visit of Jane to Scotland, of which no record is left in family tradition, is so improbable that we must imagine her to be referring to some joke or possibly some forgotten tale of her own. The Austens knew that to admit a young girl had travelled to Scotland could only mean one thing. She had gone to take advantage of Scottish law, which, unlike the English Marriage Act of 1753, permitted youths to marry without parental consent. It was common practice for young couples to travel to Gretna Green, just across the Scottish border, for a Scottish marriage, and several of Jane's cousins and nephews did so. Jane's writing from her earliest times are filled with stories of elopements and marriages performed under Scottish law. A few of the Jane Austen biographers, like David Noakes and John Halperin, have tried to find the missing facts. Halperin commented on the unsubtle ritual closing of ranks among the family and felt it helped explain why so many have laboured so long to discover what was hidden. Surely something was hidden. Could any life be so devoid of events, of crises, of attachment? And what about all that burning and pruning of her letters carried out so assiduously by Cassandra? The effect of their destruction was to suppress anything of a particular intimacy. As one critic surmised, the gaps in the letters can be expected to correspond with crises in their author's life, but she was not supposed to have had any crises. Reading and critical discussion of Jane Austen's writing is limited mainly to her 6 published novels, an area studied well, entrenched before the release of a juvenilia. Many of these early stories and plays relate directly to D'Arcy and their adventures together, but there has been little attempt by professional Austen critics and biographers to understand the zany stories or black humour of her juvenilia, their significance or their meaning. The Austen family, in protecting a name, claimed she had never left Steventon, but the fact is that it was only after D'Arcy left England that she became totally corralled within the family circle. Most fiction writers rely heavily on their own life experiences to provide material for their stories they wish to create. Jane was no different. She was a truth teller. She was the daughter of the parson, and she wanted desperately to record her most important feelings and experiences. Those her father had ruled were never to be discussed. Throughout all her stories, she reveals to the reader shards from her own early life. It was a very short period in her youth that she spent as friend and lover of D'Arcy. This period provided her with the emotional experience and knowledge of the world that she would reveal through her writing. In her maturity, Jane was more circumspect than she had been in her teens, but she described her emotional experiences. She named people and included many characters from this time. For these revelations she faced anger and criticism from her brothers. The Austen family, from the time Jane returned home, wanted her history hidden from the world. The family promoted the fiction taken up as a fundamental truth that Jane never went to London, other than the one time that she, on her return from visiting her great-uncle Francis in Kent. But we know from her juvenilia that by the age of 14, Jane knew the layout of London, the social stratification of the streets and squares. It was not possible to have written Sense and Sensibility, in which she drew so precisely on that knowledge, without ever having spent time in London. Sense and Sensibility, her first novel, she drew a vivid picture of Marianne's grief, angst and total breakdown at the end of her great love affair. It is extraordinary that anybody reading that novel could accept the Austen fiction that Jane had no experience of love. It is not hard to believe she was writing her own experience. How might a biographer of Jane Austen have unravelled the secrets of her romance with D'Arcy without the benefit I had of access to a long-held family story? I suggest they might have followed up specific facts in her stories, put together her references to real people and families, particularly the Wentworths and Fitzwilliams. In her writing, Jane made reference to members of both these families and used many of the family names. D'Arcy and Lord Fitzwilliam were cousins and loyal friends. In Pride and Prejudice, Jane gave a cameo role to Colonel Fitzwilliam, the younger son of a lord and a cousin of Mr. D'Arcy. Another important character in the novels, Wickham, was a real person. In 1813, in her letters, Jane refers anxiously to the real Wickham, who has returned to Hampshire, near to where she was living. Inexplicably, none of her critics or biographers have veered from the Austen family fictions to follow up the clues that Jane writ large in Pride and Prejudice, which could have led them to the true story of her romance with D'Arcy Wentworth. Following her elopement to Scotland, Jane held to a marriage to D'Arcy, notwithstanding that her father had refused to give his permission or to marry them formally under English law in St Nicholas in Steventon. Neither Jane nor D'Arcy ever entered into a second marriage. Jane was proud and happy to be part of the Wentworth-Fitzwilliam clan. In one of her few letters that slipped through her family censorship, after her sister Cassandra and her niece Fanny Knight referred to her as Miss D'Arcy, Jane replied to them as Mrs. D'Arcy. I believe that Jane and D'Arcy will revitalise Austen scholarship, replacing long-held fictions with facts, and that her readers, particularly those in Australia, will be delighted to know her, after all these years, as Mrs. D'Arcy Wentworth, with a place in Australian history. Thank you.